everyone. I am Donata Romizi from the Philosophy Department of the University of Vienna. And this is my contribution to the Asynchronous Conference on Integrated History and Philosophy of Science 2020. Last year, I published a book that provides a historical-philosophical inquiry on scientific determinism in the time span between the development of classical mechanics until the early 20th century. The book is the result of 7 years of research, and it was awarded some prizes, among them the Karl Albert Prize 2019. The aim of this video is not to present my book, but rather to share with you some methodological thoughts about opportunities and challenges of interdisciplinary research that have emerged in the course of my work for this book, with particular regard to the problem of integrating the historical and the philosophical perspective on science and its philosophy. I will mention only those contents of the book that I find necessary in order to give some context to the methodological questions. In this sense, I will first say some words about the motivation behind my project and how this subject led me very naturally to interdisciplinary work. In the second part of the presentation, I would like to share 3 methodological problems this interdisciplinary work implied. I will deal in detail only with the first one, so the definition problem, and I will only briefly mention the other 2. Finally, I will add some very short concluding remarks. So, part 1, context. There is a need to revise that received opinion on scientific determinism that tells us, to put it very shortly, that scientific determinism is rooted, at least historically, in Newtonian or classical physics, culminates in the Laplacian dream of an omniscient intelligence, and has been overcome through the emergence of quantum physics. This story has many flaws. For example, Ernst Cassirer and Ian Hacking have both suggested, even though in different ways, that an explicit concept of scientific determinism only emerged in the late 19th century, which is sometime after the development of Newtonian mechanics. Then, John Ehrman and John Norton were quite successful in severing the bond between scientific determinism and classical mechanics, from a systematic, not from a historical point of view. Marie van Strien questioned this bond also historically, suggesting that Laplacian determinism could not really bear on the equations of motion of classical mechanics. Not only the alleged origins, but also the alleged end of scientific determinism can be questioned. There is a lot of evidence for determinism being already eroded, to use Hacking's expression, long before quantum physics emerged. See, for example, the volume on the so-called probabilistic revolution in 19th century, edited by Krüger, Daston and Heidelberger, or the works by Michael Stelzner and Deborah Cohen on non-deterministic currents in Vienna. All this evidence shows the many flaws of the received opinion and is at the same puzzling. For example, how comes that, according to these sources, the concept of scientific determinism emerged in the same time in which determinism was eroded, in the second half of the 19th century? Out of this puzzlement, I thought that it was time to try a new overall account of scientific determinism and its history. I said in the beginning that the question of scientific determinism leads very naturally to interdisciplinarity. First, the form of determinism we are talking about is scientific. Thus, one has of course to investigate scientific theories and scientific tools, for example, differential equations. In my book, I focus especially on physics, but I also considered other disciplines like mathematics, astronomy, medicine, anatomy, and the social sciences. Second, it has proved to be fruitful in this case to adopt the historistic assumption according to which, in order to really understand a problem or a concept, in this case scientific determinism, it is necessary to reconstruct its history and to embed it in a broader historical and cultural context. When you read, for example, the common assumption according to which quantum mechanics means the end of scientific determinism as it is implied by classical physics, you have no chance to understand what it means without considering the origins of these ideas. Then you may learn from Richard Stanley that the concept itself of classical physics was a post-hoc creation by modern physicists wanting to emphasize the novelty of their theories. Since one of the novelties was a kind of indeterminism, the next time you hear that classical physics is deterministic, it will sound to you a bit like a tautology. Third, if one wants to have a chance to go through the complex and long history of scientific determinism in its different varieties without getting lost, one must do hard systematic philosophical work, to some extent a priori. Otherwise, a wealth of the historical material will lead to confusion and will make it impossible to set clear limits to the scope of the inquiry. I will give right below a concrete example of how I have created a strong philosophical structure for my historical investigations. Part 2. 3 methodological challenges of interdisciplinarity. Now that I've put my work in context, I shall deal with 3 methodological challenges that emerged in my interdisciplinary work. These are, first, the problem of defining scientific determinism in a reasonable and fruitful way. Second, the problem of holism, or of the dependence of the concept of scientific determinism on other concepts. Third, the problem of the so-called longue durée, which results from the demand of understanding the historical and cultural evolution of a given concept. So let's start with the first problem, the definition problem. Assume you have a philosophical interest in scientific determinism. And assume you really believe that historical reconstruction of the origins and the development of this concept will help you to understand it. Then you find yourself immediately in an interdisciplinary trouble. On the one hand, you want to be a well-behaved philosopher and you want to define precisely what your subject matter is. Thus, you have a sympathetic ear for the complaint of those who say, like Montague, that imprecision concerning the notion of determinism, besides being traditional, continues to provide an amazingly ample source of philosophic confusion. There is also this nice anecdote reported by Hacking. Austin was once asked, "There is more than one distinct doctrine of determinism. Do you not agree, Professor Austin?" "No," he answered tartly, "less than one." Thus, as a philosopher, you feel bound to improve precision regarding the topic. On the other hand, you want to put your topic into historical perspective, and you remember Nietzsche having said, "Only something which has no history is capable of being defined." And if you look at the accounts of scientific determinism which have been given in the last couple of centuries, you will see that what Nietzsche said is indeed radical, otherwise it wouldn't be Nietzsche, but not entirely wrong. If you take one account as a definition of scientific determinism, then scientific determinism won't have much of a history, because you could hardly recognize the other accounts as being earlier or later tokens of the same type. Each of them speaks of something different. Let's consider some examples. Here is a famous illustration of scientific determinism by Laplace, published in 1814. We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect, which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion, and all positions of all items of which nature is composed, if this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. Laplace is talking about the entire universe. He's adopting a causal talk, and he refers to a mathematical procedure of calculation. John Ehrman writes much later, but still refers to Laplace. Letting W slanted stand for the collection of all physically possible worlds, that is, possible worlds which satisfy the natural laws obtaining in the actual world. The world W in W slanted is Laplacian deterministic, just in case for any W prime in W slanted, if W and W prime agree at any time, then they agree for all times. By assumption, the world at a given time is an invariantly meaningful notion, and agreement of worlds at a time means agreement at that time on all relevant physical properties. Even if he refers to Laplace, Ehrman is not talking about the universe, but about a collection of physically possible worlds. He avoids intentionally the causal talk. Instead, he introduces a reference to the concept of natural law. He does not refer to mathematical data analysis and formulas, and prefers to speak of all relevant physical properties. Recently, the range of validity of scientific determinism has been radically weakened, as well as the ontological commitment implied by its formulation. Consider the following two examples. The key idea is that determinism is a property of a theory. At first glance, we might say that such a theory of physics, is deterministic whenever the state of a system at some initial time, plus the laws of the theory, fix that system state at any later time. Here, determinism does not concern the universe or possible worlds, but only a theory. We are not talking about natural laws anymore, but only about the laws of a specific theory. This mini-historical tour through the evolution of the concept of scientific determinism is enough to understand that if we take any of these definitions as a rigid yardstick, as precisely the concept of determinism we want to deal with, then the history of this precise concept of determinism won't probably be very long. Logical precision and historical significance of a concept seem to be inversely proportional. If you improve precision in defining scientific determinism, its history will tend to zero. If you want to put your philosophical concept in historical perspective, you have to leave your definition to a good extent open and inclusive. Dealing with the history of a concept is a kind of Heraclitean experience of merging in something which is one and the same thing and still always a different one. How did I deal with this problem? I have developed a kind of new three-dimensional conceptual system for classifying different forms of scientific determinism with a good degree of precision. The three dimensions are: first, the strengths. Scientific determinism implies that some states of some system determine some other states of the system. The strength of this determining link can be conceived of in different ways. It is maximal in those versions of scientific determinism in which some mathematical or geometrical mathematical data are calculated on the basis of others. In this case, the determining link resembles an extratemporal relation of implication, usually a bicondition. A weaker version of scientific determinism corresponds to the causal talk of previous states being the cause of the following ones. I consider this version to be weaker because the validity of the causal link is affected by the problem of induction, which can turn to be a major problem with respect to some versions of determinism. Finally, in its weakest form, determinism can be conceived of as statistical determinism. A state of the system determines another state of the system only with a certain, usually high, probability degree. This kind of weaker determinism is ambivalent. Depending on the historical and scientific context, it can be interpreted as determinism or as indeterminism. The second dimension is what I have called the depth, or one could also say the strength of the ontological commitment. Here I have substituted the classical distinction between epistemic and ontological determinism with a more differentiating one. The classical distinction between epistemic and ontological determinism is in many cases misleading if one wants to work historically. This is mainly due to the fact that the meaning of epistemic and ontological, as well as the line traced to divide the two, changes significantly in the course of history. For example, two key figures in the history of determinism, like Kant and Leibniz, mean ontological in different ways, and in ways that are in turn almost opposite to what we mean when we ascribe an ontological determinism to Laplace. So, according to my conceptual system, scientific determinism can be conceived either as a character of reality itself, and this corresponds to the maximal depth, or as a normative ideal towards which any scientific theory must tend, or as a fruitful heuristic for science, or as an empirical statement referring only to a particular, necessarily restricted empirical evidence. The third dimension, the breadth, refers to the object for which determinism is claimed to apply. As I have already mentioned, nowadays we would talk not so much about determinism as a worldview or a world picture. We would rather use a more modest predicate deterministic to talk about a specific, circumscribed object. A law, a theory, a model, a description, etc. In these cases, the alternative to determinism must not necessarily be indeterminism. There are also statistical and chaotic models or descriptions which cannot be identified with indeterminism at all. I call determinism as a world picture any version of scientific determinism that ascribes determinism to the entire physical world. And finally, I call determinism as a worldview any form of scientific determinism that explicitly extends its meaning to the realm which we would call ethical. referring for example, to the problem of the free will. Usually, scientific determinism as a worldview results from determinism as a world picture plus some form of reductionism. Now, this conceptual system allows to see different forms of scientific determinism as different forms of the same idea. At the same time, it works as an a priori frame of reference for putting the different forms emerging from the historical inquiry in a clear systematic order. It also helps to identify historical questions in a fruitful way. For example, remember the puzzle of scientific determinism emerging as an explicit concept only in the second half of the 19th century, when scientific determinism is apparently also already eroded. My classification system allowed me to reformulate the question as: why did scientific determinism reach its maximal breadth in the second half of the 19th century, when its strength and its depth had been already weakened? This reformulation in turn helped me find some answers, which I won't discuss here because it would go beyond the scope of this video. A second example of the utility of my classification system is that it allowed me to assess Kant's position about the issue in a way that goes far beyond the usual ascription to him of an ontological determinism. Let me now mention much more briefly the other two major methodological issues I had to cope with in my project. So, the holism problem. A systematic analysis of any concept of scientific determinism will reveal that this concept depends necessarily on other ones. Usually, the concept of scientific determinism presupposes some concept of an isolated physical system, some concept of a sequence of instants in time, some concept of discrete states of the system, a faith in the possibility of describing in a univocal and or in some sense complete way the states of the system. The concept, of course, of a determining relation between states of the system, which can be conceived of in different ways, as we saw. This means that the problem of scientific determinism can be hardly, or at least only artificially, isolated from other relevant questions, like the conception of time and time direction, the problem of the continuum, the problem of objectivity, or putting it like Ehrman, of establishing what all the relevant physical properties are, the problem of causality, and so on. From his systematic perspective, Ehrman writes, "A real understanding of determinism cannot be achieved without simultaneously constructing a comprehensive philosophy of science." This is an important warning for anyone who wishes to reconstruct the history of the problem of scientific determinism. This reconstruction cannot be made without becoming entangled with other major problems, so that hard systematic work is required in order to decide how large the range of problems to be considered should be and how to justify the limits of this range. Furthermore, historical awareness suggests checking for different versions of determinism to be compared whether the related concepts are really meant in the same way, so that the comparison is to a good extent ceteris paribus. It may be, for example, that two forms of scientific determinism predicate the same about the determining link between states of the system, but the way of defining the states of the system that lies behind each of the two forms is different. And here we come to the last problem, the problem of the longue durée. At this point, the philosopher aiming at historical aware understanding of scientific determinism may already start to become desperate because of the complexity and the vastness of her subject matter. The burden of the enterprise becomes even heavier if we think that the history of a concept can mostly not be conceived of as histoire événementielle, but it rather has a longue durée. Here I am referring to the distinction made famous by the historian Fernand Braudel, especially by means of his paper Histoire et sciences sociales, la longue durée, published in 1958. This beautiful article has also much to do with interdisciplinarity, since it concerns the relationship among different social sciences. It contains a wonderful description of different senses of time, which are at the bottom of different social sciences or of different kinds of historical work. Traditional history, Braudel says, looks very much like a series of punctual facts. This is the way in which political history is usually reconstructed, focusing on big events which happen at precise times. But we do also need a different sense of time, if we want to deal, for example, with the development of science, technology, political institutions, conceptual frameworks, and so on. These are not single events, nor do they develop as a chain of single events. We need a sense for the long duration in order to deal with them. This applies also to scientific determinism. It does not suddenly arise with Newton and disappears with Heisenberg. It is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. And it is hardly appropriate to simply make a list of punctual events or single works or authors allegedly decisive for its evolution. This historiographic awareness helped me keep focused in my book on the development of the conceptual aspects of scientific determinism, rather than on the philosophies of particular heroes. With only two justified exceptions, Kant and Edgar Zilsel, philosophers and scientists appear and disappear briefly in different contexts, depending on the aspects of their thought that, in the specific case, are helpful to understand the particular problem at stake. So, some short concluding remarks. The problem, questions, and examples I have mentioned so far are enough to show that an interdisciplinary approach to science and its philosophy implies a degree of complexity which is at the same time revealing and difficult to cope with. Braudel himself, who was a supporter of interdisciplinarity, repeatedly emphasizes the importance of collective work to face its challenges. He belonged to the French École des Annales, which was founded in 1929. In the same year, the Vienna Circle also recommended collective work in its manifest. My book on scientific determinism shows, I think, how an interdisciplinary approach to the topic crucially helped me detecting and amending some major shortcomings of the received view on scientific determinism. But admittedly, being my work individual and not collective, I had to accept some important limitations. For example, I had to bear much more on secondary sources than I would have liked to. And I had to neglect very relevant domains, as for example the question of determinism in evolutionary biology. The hope for the future is, of course, that much more perspectives can be integrated through some kind of collective work, leading to a better understanding of scientific determinism, a concept that still plays a crucial heuristic role in science. Thank you for your attention.